Welcome to an iGETT module on object recognition. What I'd like to do is discuss object recognition and its usefulness in aerial imagery. I'm a forester, so I will use a number of forestry examples. I believe that visual interpretation of objects is a very useful skill for a number of reasons. One, you may want to just orient yourself, or you may need to find a location. And there may be features that you're really interested in that you're trying to extract visually from an image. But most importantly, I think, is the next point. And that is that orthophotos have become our most common base maps. Many people heads-up digitize features off of these orthophotos. And being able to recognize features on these images is a pretty important role. For example, some companies may be even using high-resolution imagery to extract features like telephone poles or hydrants. In forestry, for example, we heads-up digitize forest stands before we even go out to the stand. Some of us. And if you look at your Landsat image on the left here, you can already interpret a few features. Even though this is 30-meter resolution, you can see agricultural fields. This is up in northern Maine. You're looking at Canada above the river, and you're seeing forest, and you're seeing roads and the town around the river. But you can extract some features on higher resolution, like this NAIP, this agricultural layer, 1 meter resolution on the right. You get a little bit more detail and can pull out things like roads and agricultural fields just as easily. But to get more detail, to get some individual features, the Landsat may not do you well unless you're running a classification where you can use spectral signatures to pull larger objects out of the image. Nonetheless, we can do object recognition on imagery, and the most common imagery is probably going to be a little bit higher resolution, 1 to 3 meter or better, and that's readily available. So in the state of Maine, for example, we have the NAIP. These are the agricultural layers from U.S. Forest Service, the USDA, and they're 1 meter resolution. Many states fly their own imagery. In Maine, for example, we have orthophotos that are 2 meter resolution and better, but these are leaf off. So that's one example. Let me give you just a couple other examples. In Idaho, for example, you can go to their web page and you can get quarter quads from 2013. In Mississippi, you can go to their web pages and get local high-resolution imagery. You can see here they also have the NAIP layers, and they have quarter quads which are older, from the 90s and such, as well as other layers. And you can see Landsat layers as well. So almost every state, many states, have the imagery. You can go directly to USGS and get the NAIP layers as well. And the other thing to keep in mind is these NAIP layers, you can contact your state or USGS and get the infrared band as well as the RGB bands. So please keep that in mind. So first of all, let's look at the object recognition elements. Okay, depending on who you talk to, there's 7 or 8 of them. Let's go through each one of these with some examples in terms of how we can use those to consciously identify features. And we may be using some of these things unconsciously. Size. Well, I can use, if you look at my arrow here, I can use size to identify to measure rather, the length and width of this railroad bridge. I can use size relatively, so the first one was absolute. I can use size relatively to identify that this is an automobile on a road. And knowing standard road widths, I can guess at the size of that vehicle. So just two examples. Shape is another important feature. Is there anything more classic than a baseball diamond? So its shape is pretty unique and easily identifiable. And there are many other features. For example, white pine up here in Maine and other parts of the country has a very classic crown shape that helps us identify those, but you need higher resolution imagery. Shadow can also be used to identify. We can use the silhouette, the shadow, to identify all kinds of features, including trees on the edge of a stand. Here you can see we're identifying the church by its steeple. If we had a 3D image, this would be much easier to see the steeple, but I can see the steeple's shadow, and clearly this is a church. Sight and association, I feel we do this almost instinctively. One of the things is that as you learn more and more about your field, you're going to learn more of these associations. For example, in forestry, we know that certain species grow in wet areas. Where are you going to find bald cypress? Where are you going to find northern white cedar? Where are you going to find tamarack, usually in larger numbers, right, in wet areas? And the same for drier sites and higher or slightly higher elevations. But in this image, we can clearly see that the baseball diamond, the tennis court to the east of it, other baseball fields above it, that's got to be a school, right? So we're associating those activities and that large building and the parking lot and the cars and, of course, those nice yellow buses that are south of the school to put it all together. And you would have done that instinctively, I think, just because you know those associations. And then in other disciplines, it's learning those associations. Texture, this may not be the best example of texture. And remember one thing, texture changes with scale, especially in trees. So what we're looking at here in the middle of this image, we have a cut-over stand, heavily cut-over stand. Over here, a less cut-over stand. And then over to the east, a stand that has not really been touched for some time. So the texture is indicating that there's been activity there. Obviously, there are trails here that we can associate with that activity as well. And again, texture will change with the age of a stand. Tone and color are also important, and here at the top we can see the bright tones and color of a plowed potato field. So the potatoes have been harvested. This has been a fall image, so that field has been left fallow. And on the west side of that field we can see some red maples showing the red color. We can see some aspen and birch showing the yellow color. Pattern is also a very important thing. Certain features, certain objects have certain patterns. And you could say shape is also at play here, but this is obviously a golf course. So we have a golf course by its instinctive pattern and long, narrow shapes. Now, for those of us in forestry, when we're trying to identify on higher resolution imagery individual trees, we're going to use the crown shape, the shape of the crown. We're going to use the branching patterns because that branching pattern can have a big influence on the texture. For example, aspen and birch have a coarser texture generally for average age trees because their branching is more widely spread than, say, sugar maple or beech. Also because of their foliage, sugar maple and beech have a very smooth texture. Some of that has to do with the branching pattern, unless the trees are older and broken up. The spatial distribution pattern of the species, and as I mentioned, the time of year, and we'll talk more about this in just a second. So for temperate, deciduous forest, there's the temperate region, trees that lose their leaves, time of year really helps in the identification. So again, even on Landsat, I can tell the broadleaf trees from the conifers. If you look at where the pointer is, if you look at the V-shaped road right here, just above, north of the V-shaped road, you'll see a dark patch to the left or west and a lighter green patch to the right. And the left, that darker, is conifer, and the east is a hardwood stand. If we go down to the higher resolution imagery, the NAIP layer, here's my conifer to the west of that V-shaped road, and to the right or the east is my broadleaf forest stand. So here's a close-up of that. The conifers generally have darker tones, whether it's in normal color or color infrared. The conifers tend to be the darker tones. This is a northern hardwood stand. It has that brighter greenish color. It also has a smoother texture, so we're looking at this stand right here. Northern hardwood stand, which is sugar maple and beech with some yellow birch mixed in. So again, brighter color, smoother texture. Intolerant hardwoods are going to be very difficult to distinguish on this imagery. What you don't know is that this stand here, this rectangular-ish stand, is pretty much predominantly an intolerant hardwood. By intolerant hardwood, I'm talking about pioneer species, those first to come in after a site has been abandoned, and we're talking about aspen and, in this case, paper birch. A little bit of red maple in there possibly. Okay. Also down here, this stand looks very similar, but there's probably more conifer mixed in there, but they're very hard. It's very hard to distinguish the conifer from the aspen and birch. But what I said we can do is we can use fall imagery, and by using the fall imagery we can extract trees much more readily. Here in this northern stand now we can see predominantly pioneer species of aspen and paper birch. Down here in the stand below the road, a little less and more conifer. So that fall imagery really enhances that separation of species. Looking side by side, we have again that pioneer stand in the fall color and that same stand in the normal color. We can further enhance our separation of species by using color infrared. So here again we have normal color with RGB, and on the right hand side we have that stand showing whitish because on infrared, this is a near infrared, we have yellow showing white and red showing yellow. You can just about make out some red maple down in here above my dot and barely showing yellow above the dot on the infrared side. So again, very useful seasons and also using bands to enhance spectral signatures. So points to remember then are the recognition elements. Maybe you have unique elements that help you identify particular features like the shape of baseball diamond or white pine. It's association or the color or spectral signature of an object. Additionally, when we're dealing with forest and trees, use season and use band combinations to enhance your features and to your advantage. Now with that, I'll go to questions very quickly. You can pause these whenever you like, and you can go to part 2 to get the answers to these questions. So pause as you like, but what I'd like you to tell me is why is visual interpretation a useful skill? What are the recognition elements? And can you give me an example of an object that you could easily identify by its shape, something other than the baseball diamond? Now what I'm going to do is follow with a couple of slides, pause as you need to, and I'm going to have you identify what those objects are. So first of all, what is this linear feature? What is this linear feature in the bottom of this image? What is this linear feature? Pause as you like. Can you tell me what this area in the center of this feature, in center of this image, what is this area? What would you call this? Now you've seen this image several times. What I'd like you to do is this linear feature right here, this brown linear feature on this curve, linear, tell me what that is. So if you need some resources, check these out. And if you want answers to those questions, please go to part 2 on the iGETT YouTube page. And I thank you very much for your attention. Welcome to the iGETT module on object recognition. This is part 2 where we look at the quiz questions I posed to you. In the first question, I wanted to know why you think visual interpretation of aerial imagery is a useful skill. Well, my answer really is twofold. One is, yeah, I want to orient myself. I want to find a location. I want to identify some features. But most importantly is the fact that we are going to be using orthophotos as our primary source for base maps in GIS. And many people even digitize features right off of those orthophotos. So it's good to be able to identify those features on orthophotos. Second question had to do with what are the object recognition elements. And one way to remember this is STP. Okay, and those are size, shape, shadow, sight, that's sight or association, tone or color, texture, and pattern. The third question was more open-ended, and in the third question I wanted you to give me an object or a feature that you could easily or readily identify by its shape. So it's kind of open-ended. Hopefully you're okay with this. And I'm showing you this image, and there's a bunch of things on there that are readily identifiable by their shape. The buildings, for one. Okay, the type of building may not be clear, but at least that you know that it's a building by a number of characteristics, including the shadow and the size and the association. But automobiles or vehicles, aircraft, very distinct characteristic. And I threw something a little different on here, which is an eastern white pine tree. Eastern white pine have a star-shaped pattern that's very characteristic. Open branching with kind of a star-shaped pattern. This is a little bit of a side view, and if you want to look in the image to the right, where you have the airport tarmac and then some buildings and then a road, there's a stand of trees, and you'll see several pine trees in that area. The following questions had to do with identifying specific features. So in this, I asked you what this linear feature was in the bottom of the image, and hopefully you properly identified that as an airport runway for a lot of reasons. And one is obviously its association with aircraft that are at that terminal. Second one is a little harder, and this is this area. I wanted you to identify what this area was. You can see the park-like nature of it, that there are clear paved or cement pathways. You can see that there easily could fit a vehicle on there, or possibly two vehicles on there. And if you were to look closer, you'd see row upon row upon row of grave markers. So this is a cemetery. So hopefully you got that. It's a little more challenging. Lastly, I asked for this linear brown feature, this linear feature, kind of chain-like brown, and hopefully you identified that as train cars or a train. So anyway, that's a limited set of questions, but hopefully you found this useful. And there are other resources where you can expand your horizons and learn more, but the best way is through practice. So ground truthing, getting out there, taking some imagery, especially with forest types and tree types, and other objects. And again, resolution has a lot to do with what you can see in terms of detail, but practice, practice, practice. So good luck, and thank you for participating in this iGETT module.